We're- Ladies and gentlemen, I am absolutely delighted to have returning to the show, Mary Allen. Mary, I'm delighted to have you back.
Me too. Couldn't be happier.
Well, thank you. I'm a big fan of yours.
Mm,
Yeah,
ditto.
thank you. A little bit, there's something really interesting I want to get into in a couple of minutes, but a little bit about your background, if you would.
Sure. I live in Iowa City, Iowa. I came out here from Massachusetts in the 1980s to attend the Iowa Writers Workshop. I have been writing and making a living as a writing coach for many, many years. I've recently published a collection of essays called The Deep Limitless Air that you and I talked about
I
in
love
May.
that.
Thank you. And I published the book we're going to talk about today, The Rooms of Heaven. Here it is in hardcover in, I believe, 1999. And I got an NEA grant for another memoir that I spent 20 years working on about my childhood that I haven't published yet.
Is that going to be published soon?
I don't know.
Who knows?
Another thing I want to say is that I'm almost finished writing a novel, the first fiction I've written in many, many years, which is set in the afterlife and has some of the same characters that are in this book, in that novel.
Wow, that's going to be, I'm awaiting those with, seriously, I mean, that would be great. I love your style of writing. I really do.
Thank you.
Sometimes there's very good information or an interesting book. Far be it for me to say who hasn't written anything, any books, but it just doesn't, it's, oh boy, I got myself in it now. It's laborious. I have to stay really, and focus for me is not an attribute at all. I have to stay really, really focused so I can get it.
Mhm.
Yours, the flow of it. Am I making any sense? The flow of it is just so real and so comfortable.
Yeah, when I write, I think of myself as talking to my reader and connecting to my reader. And I maybe that's also what you're thinking. It's sort of like, even though I wasn't standing there with you when you were reading this book, I think of myself as us connecting and me doing that with every reader.
That's wonderful. Again, the book that we're talking about, tell us a little bit about, because it's been out now for 20.
Long time. Okay, I'll hold it up again. It's
For listeners, it's The Rooms of Heaven. Go ahead.
This is the hardcover. There's a paperback too with a different cover, which is more available in bookstores if it is in bookstores. I wrote this book after something really major happened in my life. I had never written memoir. I was a fiction writer. I thought I came to the workshop to be in fiction, but I knew that I had to write about what happened. And I couldn't make it work with fiction. And my good friend, Joanne Beard, was also experimenting with creative nonfiction. And it came to me to write this book as a memoir. And it is the story of falling in love with someone who had a drug and alcohol problem, his suicide, and this sort of crazy route I took to healing afterwards, where I brought him back to life in certain ways and got locked up in the psych ward for it. Just, I know sounds very heavy, but I don't think of the book that way.
No, of course, you deal with it in a book, obviously. When you say heavy, there are parts that are, for me, how can you not have some empathy or compassion for you in reading the book? You're right. I wouldn't say heavy, but there's some moments in the book. I'm thinking some specifically that I paused. I needed to pause and think about it a little bit before I could have gone on. It's not like I couldn't have, but before I chose to move on, I just wanted to ponder a little bit.
Yeah.
your writing style. You just told me something 10 minutes ago before we went on air. Share that if you would, Mary Ellen.
Well, in preparation to getting to have the wonderful gift of talking to you about this book, Louis, I reread it for the first time in 22 years or something. And I'm not quite done. I'm 93% finished I read it in Kindle because it's easier for me to read fast on Kindle. And that in itself was a remarkable experience that I think I'm going to have to write about, because it brought it all back. And I had a new perspective about myself and what happened. And also, I am now in a pretty new relationship that is almost like full circle of that story, the happy ending that I didn't get to have with the guy in this book. And I don't even know what to say about reading it, except I also had kind of like what I would call a trauma response, where I was like, oh, that was hard. The first part, especially, the first part that leads up to the death, which deals quite a lot with what it was like to really be in love with somebody that had serious drug and alcohol problems and just kind of deteriorated and then killed himself. And then the second part is all about this sort of wacky thing that I did that turned into mental illness. And when I was reading that, I felt embarrassed, like, oh my God, I can't believe I admitted to all of this stuff. And then the third part is sort of about me being restored to sanity in myself. And also about my views of the afterlife, which came to me as part of this experience. And then I felt relief, like, oh, thank God I wrote about being sane again.
That's very interesting. I'm glad you shared that, Mary Ellen, because it's got to be, when I think about you reading it after a couple of decades, the embarrassed part I find very courageous of you to be able to write about that. And again, I didn't write about it. You did. It's about you. I found it very courageous and very straightforward. And that's what we need, because others will have read your books. It's been out a while. Again, The Rooms of Heaven. And I believe will give them the courage to talk about it. It's like, wow, Mary Ellen doesn't just talk about it. She wrote about it for everyone to read.
Right. I know. And I was relieved when I read it to see that I didn't try to gloss things over. And I also didn't try to pretend that there wasn't something a little, off about a lot of the stuff that was happening inside me. But I also didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I didn't want to throw out the guy, even though he had drug and alcohol problems. There was love there, and I wanted to let that stay in the book. And also, I do believe in the afterlife. I still do, and I didn't want to throw that out either, even though I got pretty far gone with that stuff.
Writing the book, initially you wrote it over 2 decades ago. What did it feel like? If that's not too hard of a question.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Did it just flow? Oh, go ahead.
Well, no writing ever really just flows. It was very hard for me to find the right voice when I was starting it. And then the next big struggle was, how do I tell the truth about his addiction, and not make him a bad guy? And how do I keep the love in there too, and not have it seem like I wasn't telling the truth about the addiction? So that was the next big struggle. And then a huge struggle was how to write the second half after he died. And I had a contract with Alfred Knopf at that point, which never happens these days. And they just took it on without even exactly knowing what the second half was going to be. And I sort of thought I knew what the second half was going to be, but it wasn't. When I tried to write it, it didn't work very well. And I was freaking out because I had this contract. And then one day I just sat down and started writing about what happened and all that stuff about automatic writing and getting involved with the afterlife and everything. I wasn't even going to really tell that in the book. But that was what was interesting. And so the second half was completely different than what I thought it was going to be originally. And it's my favorite part of the book, actually.
When you, Mary Ellen, when you said difficulty finding your voice initially, can you explain that to non-writers?
Sure. Well, because I had tried to write fiction until then, the whole idea of actually memoir where I was talking to the reader as myself, looking back on something, that had to be exactly pitch perfect. And I wanted to talk to the reader. But it took a while for me to find my genuine voice in which I really was talking to the reader. And I did it partly because I had originally written a letter to my close friend, Kathy, who also is in this book. And that was the voice of talking to her in a letter that I used in this book.
That's that again, maryallen.com. Also, iowawritingcoach.com also. And I love the fact that you coach people and write.
Yeah.
And what do you do in your spare time? I know there is no spare time, right?
I know it.
There is no spare time.
That's a good question I ask myself all the time. Writing, is always the big challenge for anybody. Where do we fit that into our lives? It's kind of like fitting yourself into your life. And I have these ways that I work with time that make it possible for me to do some writing still, and I'm still generating new material. I wrote a novel in a pretty short amount of time. So my spare time, I don't know, rake my leaves, work with my house. I don't have any spare time, Louis.
Yeah, tis the season, right, for leaf raking, right?
I'm sorry, say again.
Tis the season for leaf raking,
yeah.
Right?
Actually, my new partner is raking the leaves in my house, so that's a nice thing. That's a whole other story.
Is it okay if I ask you? I'm just, there's no,
I would love it.
I'm told that my greatest asset is also my greatest liability. No filter between the brain and the mouth. the new, can you tell us a little bit about your love story? And
well, because the love story in the Rooms of Heaven is in a book, I've been very public about my love stories. And that's one of my topics as a writer is love. Love is really interesting to me. And somebody said in a review of the Rooms of Heaven that it makes the mystery of love more interesting or more important than the mystery of death. Or anyway, so yeah, I am in a new relationship, about 8 months old, and it's almost, I don't know, I don't want to go too far with this, but it's like
wherever you want to go.
The story.
So
the story is a love story. The guy killed himself. It was love us, interrupt us, as he used to say when he was petting his cat and they had to stop. Jim said that. And I fell in love with somebody, and he's not Jim Beeman at all. And it's a really real relationship, but there's something about it that kind of makes me think of that love that I had for Jim Beeman and the love that he had for me. The love itself feels similar, but we don't have the problems.
Yeah.
And it's like getting to have the real relationship that I did not get to have with Jim Beeman. And when this relationship started, this new one, I had a dream that I was in a restaurant with this new guy that I hadn't even exactly gotten together with. And he said, I have to talk to a friend. And he came back and Jim Beeman's truck was next to him. And from that, I got the sense that even to Jim, this is what he would have wanted to have with me, was this kind of real relationship with this great person that I'm with now, who's just totally shows up for me, helps me with all kinds of things, and it's just there. So Anyway,
I'm
that's
really
a
glad
big story for me.
you deserve that, Mary
Thank
Ellen.
you,
I'm
Louis.
really, I mean, yeah, I'm really delighted to learn more about the relationship. I do want to say hi to Jack at the shop around the corner. Hi, Jack. One of the lines in the book, and you again, you know my style. I jump back and forth. Death is like hypnosis, only you can't stop.
Stop.
When I thought about, I mean, that was one. Let me read that again. Think about it. Let me read it again. Let me think about it. Can you address that at all? I mean, I know
I'd
that's just
love to address that.
one line in a book that's over 300 pages. I've got other
Well,
things underlined. I've got other things marked.
so I think we have to tell the reader that after Jim died, the guy at the center of this book, I started talking to him through this thing called automatic writing. And it's, you hold a pen and it writes something, and there's a long tradition of it in psychical research and all that. Anyway, that was one of the things he said. The dead guy said, death is like hypnosis, only you can't stop. And I had hypnotized him when he was alive. And I am very interested in the unconscious myself. That's been part of my story too, is I went to a hypnotist many years ago because I had a phobia of flying and a phobia of speaking. And you travel down to your deep inner self. And the idea that I have about the afterlife is that it's about going down into that place that's deep inside yourself. And on the other side of that, there's a door, and in there is the afterlife. It's not going out there, up there. It's going deep inside yourself. And you're very tangled up with your own consciousness and your own psychology in that place. And to me, that's what he meant when he said death is like hypnosis, only you can't stop. And he wanted to stop the hypnosis when I did it. He was like, oh, let's stop that. He didn't like it because it was painful. And I think what I read him saying is that he killed himself to get away from everything. And the message I got from him was, nah, don't do that, because you can't really get away from it because it's still inside you. And that's what happens when you die, is you still work with what's inside you.
Mary Ellen, when you also talk about Ouija boards.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I want to share this with you. And this was 30 plus, maybe 40 years ago. I toyed with it. I shouldn't say toyed with it. Did things, when you're young, a kid, teenagers, whatever, at a party, get out the Ouija board. At least we did. There was an experience that I had, and I want to take the time telling a long story that was so accurate.
Mm,
That's I mean, it was weird. I shouldn't say weird.
yeah.
It was astounding because it was like what came out happened. Now, the flip side of that is I had a very bad experience with a Ouija board and ended up taking it out and on the backyard burning it. It was just,
Mm-hmm.
it was, I mean, it was bad. It was bad. Dealt with death, and I shouldn't have burned it, but it just seemed at the moment, it seemed like the right
Good
thing to do.
idea. Yeah.
Tell me about Ouija boards with you, and you write about
Well,
it in your
that
wonderful
what you
book, The
just
Rooms of Heaven.
described is a lot like my entire experience that I chronicle in The Rooms of Heaven. I was just reading this last night about the Ouija boards and how strange they are, because it's something you can buy in the store in the toy section, but it's implement that's supposed to allow you to talk to dead people, but nobody really takes them seriously and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I came to the spirit of Jim Beeman partly through the Ouija board, and it was that's another thing I feel a little embarrassed by. But when I was reading it last night, I thought, no, it all makes sense. And he and I had bought one together. And because he had had a weird experience with a Ouija board when he was young too. And it was his idea to mess with it. And then he ended up insulting it, which I laughed and laughed when I read that part last
Yes.
night. He said something really obscene to the
Yes.
Ouija board. Anyway, But after he died, somehow we ended up getting it out. And of course, it doesn't, just sort of goes around and around and not much happens. But then I asked it, it came to me to ask it a question. Are you glad you did what you did? Meaning killed yourself. And it said, no. And that's when I had this first little moment of, I am actually talking to somebody here. So that's how, and then I gave up on the Ouija board and started doing the writing quite soon after that.
Right. That's again interesting. When I was reading that, now I'm thinking maybe I should get a new Ouija board and see what happens.
Well, I've had other people say to me since, like, don't ever mess with a Ouija board.
Yeah,
You're opening the door to stuff.
that's stuff. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's kind of what happened. I opened the door wide open to all of whatever there is in that place. But I don't regret it at all. I just wouldn't recommend doing it now. I mean, I'd never do it again. I would never have anything to do with the Ouija
Probably
board
very
again.
good advice, sage advice. I'm gonna take you up on that, but I'm gonna obsess about, oh, what if I did? What if I
Yeah. Oh, I know.
probably won't. Yeah, I've heard people say that. And you also, if we can talk about your tarot, the tarot for two.
Yes.
Here,
Thanks for
when
asking.
I still like the imagery and some of the things that tarot can, I would say, point out, fill me with.
Yeah.
Yet years ago, when I was really into it, people would say the same thing. It's evil. It's this. It's that. And they make judgments before knowing anything about how is this deck of cards. How are these cards evil in and of
Yeah.
themselves?
Right. Totally. People make judgments before they know anything about it. That's the whole deal. And I am a long time tarot card reader, and I have a friend that she is also really into the tarot, and we've been doing these practices together for many years. And now I pull 4 cards every day, and we send them to each other on an app, a little video app, and try to figure out what they have to do with the day. And sometimes they really talk and sometimes they don't. So I don't think anything evil can come through the tarot cards at all. It just wouldn't be possible. But there are some kind of dark cards that we get mad at the cards. Oh, shut up. Don't tell us that.
I've had some dark experiences, but not evil coming through. Again, the way they will say it, it's almost like if you put the cards out, somehow an evil force is going to get inside of you or something like that. And they know nothing. By the way, the card that I've related to for decades is the Fool.
I love the Fool. It's a great card.
Yeah, the Fool is, yes.
It's about setting forth on a new cycle of your life.
Well, and I love the imagery on it, where the Fool is at the precipice, the dog's bark. Well,
Yes.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor, but that's my card.
I love that. And the card that I associate with Jim, the guy at the heart of the Rooms of Heaven, is the Magician, because he was very mercurial and there was something magical about him all the way through, including what happened to me after he died.
So let's talk about a couple of other things in your book, The Rooms of Heaven, a story of love, death, grief, and the afterlife, available everywhere and everywhere online. MaryAllenWriter.com. We've got links up, of course. When you write about, books that tell stories about people dying usually end with death. When I read, tell me about it.
Well, I knew death was not the end of the story for me. And I don't believe, I think our whole idea that when somebody dies, they're just canceled and they, that's it. They're gone, whatever. And that just doesn't work for me. And I think it's one of the ideas we have in the culture that makes us kind of sick, is to think that anybody is something that can just turn into nothing. And I kept looking and looking for some book that showed how death is not the end of the story, and I didn't find one, and I just wrote my own.
I love that. I love that when you wrote about that you kept going and passing them down because it wasn't what you were looking for. So you decided to write one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Marianne, I love that when I read that about you go here, the library, etc. You just could not find a book that you could relate to.
Yeah. I couldn't find a book that I could relate to.
Yeah. So you wrote one.
So I
love
wrote
that.
my own. Yeah. Thank you. It worked too. It was quite efficient. Well, not efficient, but it did do the job.
The experience of writing it, again, unimaginable for most, certainly unimaginable for me. And again, I love your
Well,
openness in it. Do you recall? I know it was decades ago.
you mean like, was it painful, or for the most part,
Just
it
what
felt
was it?
good?
Yeah, good. Okay.
Well, it felt good to
I'm
get
just
in there and work with all of that stuff and make sense of it. And also it was a way to find him again, was through writing about him. But there were a few spots where it was like, oh, this is kind of painful to think about this. But I was very much into truth telling at that time. I still am, but it really comes through in that book. I wanted to tell the truth and get at the truth and put it out there. And I don't mean this in a religious way, but I read once that one of the characteristics of God is truth, which is very interesting when you think about everything that's happening politically. But I felt I really wanted to find the truth and put it there. So it was a great experience for me writing this. And also it was the first time I had ever actually finished a book or finished a project. And it was hard because I didn't know how to write exactly then. I still had weak writing muscles. Now my writing muscles are strong. But then it was like, oh, really hard to get some of that stuff down. But I did.
And gifted it for everybody, which I love. You know that. And also, how do I want to say it? Not sure I like the expression of gives others permission to speak.
Yes.
Out. Permission.
Absolutely.
I should find a better word. You should find a better word for me.
I agree with that.
Sorry.
I know, but I do agree with that, Louis, that it's like when one person tells the truth about what really happened to them and how they really felt about it, and that gives others permission to do that too. And so there's something healing about that. I really believe that. And I sort of even believe that's part of my job in the world as a writer, is to tell the truth, to give others permission to tell their truths. And so, yeah, I love that idea.
Again, on a small level, I was sexually abused when I was very young and went on for years. And I started to speak. This was before my radio days, talk with people about it. And we talked to a panel of us, talked to a group of psychologists, therapists. And when I started on radio, it was interesting to me because at some point I started to talk about it, and I blogged about it. And I heard from people that said, I never talked about it. Guys, men, again, I'm not saying, but men are generally different with things like we push it down. Down. And not that some women don't, but I'm a man. I know better about how a man deals with it than a woman, of course. And it was just interesting. I actually had people that got in touch with me that were molested by the same Orthodox priest. And it was interesting. Wow. And I liked when I heard from people, and again, this is minimal to what you do. They said, I never heard another man, again, decades ago, never heard another man talk about being molested. And
I have chills. Yeah. And I know. And because sexual abuse, particularly by clergy, is also something that nobody, the church doesn't want anybody to know about it, or, there's so much pressure to not tell the truth with sexual abuse, always, including the whole experience of it. So yeah.
And interestingly, as I laugh about it sometimes, my own, not anybody else's, but I'm not Christian. Didn't go to that church, certainly. How did this happen? And I thought about,
right? Just your
Yeah.
luck, right?
Yeah, it was just interesting. But when you write what you wrote about everything in detail,
Yeah.
permission for others, it's I don't want to use, but I'm going to use it anyhow. The overused phrase of "me too," but I'm certain that there's
Oh,
many, many, many people, Marianne. I'm sure you've heard from some that said I had a similar.
oh, I've heard from many people who said that to me. I had similar experiences. Thank you for writing this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's got to be
Yeah.
very gratifying for you.
Yeah, it is, because that's one of the things that I feel about being a writer, is that it's a kind, I'm here to give voice so that other people can have their voices too somehow.
I love that. And again, you write in The Rooms of Heaven a story of love, death, grief, and the afterlife, Mary Allen. And early on, you wrote about a Jim and the drug habit during the Vietnam War. Very open about it, and how you followed it through was interesting to me. Can you tell
Yeah.
us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, he would be the first person to say, oh, I can't blame it on Vietnam. It was me. And
Interesting.
I, but that was a different era. Drugs were much more common, people were doing it, but he had a very addictive personality. So it took over his life. It ruined his life and it killed him. And it wasn't just drugs, it was alcohol too. He was an alcoholic. That's a drug, alcohol.
Sure.
And, um, and I got a major crash course in what that means, to be an addict and an alcoholic, and also to love one. And that's partly what this book is about too. And it's the thing that I was very aware of was how much, again, the culture really wants to suppress that stuff, and it wants to blame. It wants to make it
Right.
all the fault of the alcoholic or all the fault of the drug user. And even to talk about it the way I did, I felt like, a little bit of shame and pushback, like we're supposed to make this guy look like a bad person. And I did not want to do that. And that was part of the struggle with the book, was that. And to make a really long story short,
Please.
at one time, when this book came out, it was the golden age of the literary memoir. And there was this piece of this got accepted by the New York Times Sunday magazine, which was doing a literary memoir, and it was edited by an assistant. And I felt like she edited just a little to make him look like a bad person. And I just couldn't handle that. This is not people who have drug problems are not bad people. They are sick people.
Yeah. Again, I have experience, no expertise in it. I generally feel some kind of trauma, some kind of
Yeah.
trauma.
Without question.
Yeah. When I hear about some of the ads now, it's like, basically it's not your fault. It's, maybe you had a relative that, I think that takes the power away from, it's just, again, I'm editorializing. I don't, and in some cases, certainly, there probably is family history or something. Yet people have to take responsibility for it. And
Oh, for sure.
however you got there, I'm here now.
Right. You're not supposed to hurt people because you've been hurt.
Exactly.
Right? Is that what we're saying? And that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm talking about drugs and
I know you're not.
alcohol.
No. I
Yeah.
know you're not. I know you're not, Marianne. I know that. I'm going to send you a song. I kept thinking about it and reading the book. Sam Stone by John Prine. I don't know. Sam Stone came home from the war. And, the refrain is, "There's a hole in Daddy's arm where all the money goes." Oh, I'm going to start every
Right.
time I hear it, I start tearing up. So I'm not going to go any
Oh,
further. I'll send you a link to the song. It's absolutely, it's powerful. It's powerful. And a lot of younger people don't remember what it was like back then. dealing with him,
Yeah.
as you write, and your, should I say, perseverance. I believe, Mary Ellen, a lot of people, not judging either way, would have been out the door way before.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not
Right.
judging either way. I'm not saying that that's better or what you did. How could I judge? It's probably different for everybody. What do you think it was about Mary Ellen that you kept fighting for him, and
Yeah.
at painful for yourself, at great pain for yourself?
I think like with most things people do, it was a mixture of um so-called character defects in me. I fear of abandonment, couldn't let go. I had this, idea that I was saving him. So it was that, but it was also something larger. It was love, and love, I still believe it is the most powerful force in the universe, even though we don't want to admit that. I just, and also this was my story. This was the story I got. And there was no way I was going to give that up. Somebody said to me, I don't know if I'll let you stay in this relationship. And I said, you'd have to tie me to a chair and shoot me to get me to stop, because that was my story. That's what I got. And I had to follow it right to the bitter end and beyond into
And
the
beyond.
other.
And again, write about it incredibly, beautifully. I'm going to say beautifully and intense. The Rooms of Heaven, a story of love, death, grief, and the afterlife. I'm going to say that my audience certainly knows, I don't go chapter by chapter. Well, here you wrote that, it's not, you buy the book and read the book. We're learning about the author of the book. So or they say, what's the book about? And never opened it up. I'm sorry. Now but one of the things I want to ask you about, you learned about grief, obviously in a very personal way, and afterlife. So let's
And
start with grief. Go ahead. You were going to say something,
with
Mary.
grief. And is there anything particular you're thinking of? I mean, that
I
grief
know that,
is,
yeah,
yes.
very broad. I understand it's very broad. I've done a lot of interviews with authors that write about grief, tsunami of
Yes.
grief, and how people deal with grief, and you can't judge anyone else's, and what not to say, like time will make it better.
Right. Don't tell
Time is not
anybody
gonna,
not to
don't tell me. Well,
feel
I
grief.
will tell you, I had a lady in a couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, actually. And her daughter had been lured to a farmhouse in Western Pennsylvania,
Mm,
invited there by whom she thought was her girlfriend, but her girlfriend had
mm.
another girlfriend. They beat her and buried her alive.
Oh my God.
And I'll never forget, I get chills when I think about it, what she said to me. Please don't tell me it's part of God's plan that my daughter was lured there
Yeah.
and beaten and buried alive. People say
Yeah.
part of God's plan. And again, I know they're well intended. But you got to think first of how it's received. It's not about you being well intended. It's about what you're saying to someone.
Yeah. Yeah. And the kindest thing you can do for anybody is sometimes the hardest, which is just listen to them. Don't
Yes.
tell them how they can
Yes.
feel better
Yeah.
or anything. And yeah, grief takes what it takes. And there's a lot of pressure to get over it, do it fast, let go of the dead person. And
Yeah. Of course. It's
yeah,
painful.
yeah. And then also people are like, don't, the afterlife, that's stupid. Just stop thinking about that. So the afterlife is something I've been very deeply interested in. And as I said, I'm writing a novel that's set there. I've read a ton of things about it. I have a blog, which is about writing a novel set in the afterlife and how I got interested in it. And I say in this book, I couldn't go on with life until I had figured out death. And that's really what it was for me, is I had to find something out, at least by my lights. I felt like I did find something out.
You did. Do
A
you want?
lot of stuff.
Yeah, a lot of stuff. And like you say, with the automatic writing, it's et cetera. in Rooms of Heaven. Again, we've got links up to maryallenwriter.com. Can I keep you for like
I
10
would
seconds?
love that.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
I'm talking with Mary Allen. You are listening to Louis B. Free Radio Show, Brain Food from the Heartland, copyright Be Free Radio Limited 2022, produced by the lovely Miss Bunnyface in cooperation with White Rabbit Productions. You know, there's your website's very interesting also. Again, some of the articles, I Can Finally Forgive My Mentally Ill Mother, is up there. The Cowboy Justice firsthand account of the deadly 1991 campus shooting 31 years later, and much more. And you blog a little bit more about
Yes.
your website, Mary Allen.
Okay. Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, it's sort of an ongoing thing. What am I going to put on there? I have so
Yeah.
many different projects going on, but the
You sure
blog
do. You sure
is,
do.
somebody told me you need to start a blog and then you need to focus it on something. And I thought long and hard about what I wanted to focus it on. And I decided to focus on what it's like to write a novel set in the afterlife, like I said. So that's on the website. If there's one thing I would want people to read, it might be that. Because yeah, I've been writing steadily for like 35 years or something, and my interests as a writer have evolved over time, as well as and so have the projects, and so the website kind of reflects that too. And it's fun to have a place where me as a writer is kind of represented.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful website, Mary Allen Writer, ALLEN writer.com. We talked earlier about you reading the book again after a couple of decades. And again, this is probably, again, I'm the king of the bad analogy with people I know, but I was really enthralled by a book that I read in probably, I keep saying 30, probably closer to 40 years ago. And I still have the book. And I thought, I wonder how I would feel about it, because I just loved that book back when I was much younger. Loved it. And I started reading it again. And some of it was like great. And some of it was like, Louis, really? You really loved this
I
book?
know.
But it was fun. It was fun. I was a roller coaster for me. You were rereading, I know we talked a little bit about it earlier, a book that you wrote about your
Yeah.
experience and hadn't read it in a couple of decades.
Yeah. Yeah. It was an amazing experience. I can't even describe it. But one thing I will say is if they would let me loose on this book, I would make some changes, and I would cut some things down. And so I had that experience, but once I got on to a certain part of it, then I was riveted by it. And it was really strange. It was like getting a vision of myself when I was younger. And I think of those, those Russian dolls where there's a little doll and a bigger doll and a bigger.
Yes.
I feel like that. I feel like that version of me is still inside me, like the little doll and the Russian doll, but I'm not that person anymore. And so it is me, but it's not me. And so that was very interesting. And then me as a writer too, I was very interested in that. And there were a lot of pieces of the story I didn't even remember. And it was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Oh, that was awful. Or, oh, look at that. That's pretty well written. That it was like that. And I'm happy with it. I'm pleased to say that I've had that same experience where books I have loved, 30 years ago, I started reading, was like, nah, I don't like that anymore. But this book I still liked. I still felt
This is
in
your
some
story,
ways,
though. This is
yeah,
you.
yeah. And for years, I had no perspective on this book. And it's like, how you can't really see yourself. You
Yes.
can't really see your writing either. And I had zero sense of this book. And so reading it this time, I kind of got a sense of it and I liked it. I thought, oh, that's a pretty good book. I see why people like that.
Zero sense of the book. You had zero sense. Explain
Yeah.
that.
Well, I just couldn't get any kind of fix on it at all. I didn't, I had been, some people said it was good, and I liked that, but I just couldn't see it in the same way that I've always had a hard time seeing myself. I think that's kind of common. And then I had it particularly because my mother had postpartum psychosis, so I wasn't seen as an infant. But I feel like now in my old age, I'm starting to see myself, and that's a really good thing. And is, because you know how like your own ideas about yourself get in the way, like you don't like yourself, or somebody's negative message is like a temp holding up in front of your face when you see yourself, or you focus on one thing that you think somebody else would hate. To actually see yourself in a neutral, humble, loving way is a very big deal.
It's gotta be
And
powerful.
same thing with this book, like I reading it, I could see it. Um, I want to say another thing that's related to this is I could also see Jim Beeman, the guy in this book,
Yeah.
more clearly, and I could see the relationship more clearly. And he is a character in this novel I'm writing set in the afterlife.
Yeah.
And I, through his point of view, imagined him experiencing, looking back on his last day when he killed himself. And that was amazing to be able to open up that perspective in that novel. But having read The Rooms of Heaven again, I think I can do something different, do something better even in that novel about him and the relationship with him. And because, when somebody kills themselves, they automatically become this idealized version of themselves. And in some ways, even though I wrote this really honest book, I still had an idealized version of that relationship.
When you can do more, like you said, with the novel, Mary Ellen. I want to say hi to Donna, Jim, and Louise weighing in, and some other emails. I'm sorry, I just can't get to them yet, but I will at some point. Mary Ellen, suicide. There was a good friend of mine whose partner
Mm.
killed himself a year ago today. And I
Mm.
think about suicide a lot. And for me,
Yeah.
I think the way my perspective is, and I hope you don't mind my saying this, and this is more for me, for personally, that this is how I feel. I need to look at it. Can be vicious. It's pretty vicious to everybody else, because
Oh,
I think
yeah.
people would say, you know what, I should have called him last night, or
Oh,
he
yeah.
texted me
No
last week
question.
and I never got, or what didn't I see? And for forever, I mean, for the rest of their lives, they
Absolutely.
right. So what is it like for you
Yeah. Oh, I
in that
totally
regard?
agree with that. Well, again, I got a crash course on suicide and what it's like to be on the other end of it as a survivor. And
Sure.
it's yeah, I understand that people do it. I don't really know why they do it, but maybe it's not as cut and dried as you make the decision and you ignore your loved ones. But it is a terrible thing to do to the people who love you. I got this opportunity to try to talk somebody out of committing suicide. And I used all the arguments on him I would have wanted to use on Jim Beeman. And one thing I said was, you would not poke your mother's eyes out, but you will hurt her more
That's
if you kill yourself. And he said, I don't think that's fair. And I said, fair to who? And he
fair.
said, fair to the
Fair.
person who kills themselves.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, but anyway, he did it anyway. He killed himself. My arguments did nothing. And there's just tremendous suffering, especially for people whose children have committed suicide. I feel like that's one of the lowest circles of hell. And I've talked to a fair number of suicide survivors, because after The Rooms of Heaven came out, that was one of the things I did. And yeah, it's a term. I mean, yeah, don't ever do it is all I ever say to anybody. Never do it. And even Jim Beeman, I mean, I feel like I really did talk to him after he died. He said, oh, I wish I never had done that. And he said, it doesn't solve your problems. It does, if anything, it makes them worse, and there's no way out. And
Yeah, you can't undo it.
yeah, you can't
Yeah.
undo it. That's the thing. You can't undo it.
When you say that about suicide, how it was explained to me when I was talking with someone in the field, said, well, that's a little harsh, because you don't understand. To me,
Yeah.
I don't understand what it's like to get in that dark of
Yeah.
I still question that. No, I've never been quite in that dark of a place. I've been in some dark places, yet not that dark of a place that I can't feel or think about how it would impact others. So I can't judge it. I don't know if that's the rationale when people do it or not, but it's just you leave well, as it's a trail of tears that doesn't go away. Correct?
Big trail of tears. Yeah. Yeah. It's, yeah, the whole thing brings up big issues of forgiveness. When you're, I mean, I believe actually that when you're in the afterlife, you get to feel the way that your actions impacted others, and you have to learn to forgive
Yeah.
yourself too. And, and, um, you know, sometimes I just think you have to go, okay, sometimes that's just what happens. People just do that. And we have to, if you've been impacted by it, you've got to deal with that in some way. And then writing this book was partly my way of dealing with it, and also trying to help others deal with it. Even though, and I have so much sympathy for anybody whose loved one has committed
Oh,
suicide.
yeah. And as I do to you,
Yeah.
Mary Ellen, The Rooms of Heaven, a
Thank you.
story of love, death, grief, and the afterlife. I want to get back into the afterlife about a couple of
Yeah.
minutes.
Talk about
So
that.
you went from that, I'm not saying it erases or balances or anything, that horrific grief, which still had, to communicating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And also to change my views of the world, to see, well, he might not be here in the body, but he's still around somewhere. I still feel his presence sometimes, and it's unmistakable. And of course, culture wants to tell you you're making it up, but I don't think I am making it up. And that changes a lot if you can feel connected. And I do believe that's possible with any kind of death. And I just recently read this really wonderful book called The Physics of God, and it
Mm.
has all the newest scientific stuff, physics and string theory and all of this, and it connects it to our reality in this world, and it made me realize, like, yeah, actually afterlife is not such a crazy idea when you really look at what contemporary science tells us. What is, we don't understand what this world is, and that's why we think that world isn't possible. But it just sort of was like, oh yeah, it's not a crazy idea that there's an afterlife. It's a crazy idea that there isn't one.
Yeah, I agree, Mary Ellen. I spoke with an author a few weeks ago that wrote about near-death experiences,
Hmm.
and I had an attorney from Cleveland attorney that took a pro bono case. It was really important, and
Mm,
he was in studio with me, and I didn't know we were talking, and
mm,
he had a near-death experience many years ago, and he said,
mm.
I no longer fear death."
Yeah.
I've heard that from others. Another friend that in the hospital had a near death experience, and you think about that, and I can't say they all because I haven't spoken with them all. I've heard so many experiences of people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so fascinating. The whole idea of it is fascinating to me. And the resistance to the idea is fascinating to me too, because there's a lot of resistance, cultural resistance to that idea.
I had an author on a number of years ago. I'd love for her to come back, Dr. Sherry Cormier, that wrote a book and had
Mm.
not, I don't recall exactly how, a visitation from her husband that
Mhm.
had passed. And he said, "Get here, you'll see it's brilliant." And I'm
Yeah.
paraphrasing, but that's comforting for people. I
Yeah.
personally had a dear friend that died a few years back. I know people think I'm whack with this. I had a couple of experiences where I know if I say he was here,
Yeah.
but very comforting and close experiences with him. And was
Yeah.
reluctant to tell his sister, who I'm also friends with, who's a devout Catholic, because I didn't want to. And when I decided I needed to tell her how powerful it was for me, Mary Ellen, that she started to cry, because she said, "I'm so glad." She said, "I was waiting to hear from someone who had a visitation from him." And then we both started crying. But it was just so, so powerful when you have that. And again, you connecting with Jim through that. I know, I'm sure there are people that say, "No, no way, it's her imagination," or me, it was my imagination, or I was dreaming, or whatever. If you haven't had an experience like that,
Yeah.
you really can't say for me what it was like.
Right, exactly. Yeah, precisely. Yeah, and if you read that book about the physics and on all of that, you see this life too is a lot different than how we experience it. And uh, so why can't there be something like that? And all those near-death experience books, people, many people have reported these experiences now. So are we going to argue with all those people's experience and say they didn't have them?
Yeah, you can't, you know, you can't, you can't judge that.
Right. No, and
Somebody
you
else's
can't.
experience, what they had. You're going to tell me that what I experienced very vividly, very powerful, I didn't have, or it wasn't,
Right.
or what are you saying? Right.
Yeah. And there's this piece that I was just reading in the Rooms of Heaven where the narrator, who was me back then, is talking about that gigantic thing where they're scanning the universe for evidence of life on other planets. And it's like, why aren't we looking for our own dead people? It's our
Yes.
mothers,
Yeah.
it's our husbands.
Yeah.
Why can't we just look for them? And instead of being so mechanically outwardly focused, it has to be on another planet.
I agree. And by the way,
Oh,
The Deep Limitless Air, a memoir in pieces, the other book that we spoke about last time, is absolutely
I
beautiful.
think we
I
just
would,
froze.
yeah,
There, are we back?
I,
Oh,
oh, you're from, uh,
there, now we're
there you
back.
are. Okay.
Yeah, I know.
You'll
Eek.
be able to see how many pages I have turned down in your book.
Great.
The Rooms of Heaven, I had to stop. I had to just make notes, because the pages were all going to be turned down. And I love to
I
read,
love that.
I said earlier, the flow of what you do and how powerful that is. And once again, I love the fact that you reread it before this interview,
Me too.
and that you shared that with me and then us, because of what that was like. And of course, you're seeing your writings, 20 years later, but still a
Yeah,
powerful experience for you.
very. Yeah. Thank you, Louis, for
Oh,
making that happen and for talking
oh,
to me about this book.
Mary Ellen, I love you. You're just amazing. And I love the connection that we built from originally your infamous Air book. And you're working on a novel, you never stop. And a little bit more about your website before we split.
Well, anybody
Sorry.
who's interested in me as a writer can go there and find some stuff out about other stuff I've written and this novel. And I'm happy to have that information out there in the world. And on a website, of course, is always an ongoing, update. You got to keep it updated. And it's like, oh no, I hope it's a good enough website. But I am happy, so happy to be connected to anybody who is at all interested in my writing. And as you, Louis, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mary Ellen. Thank you. Iowa Writing Coach, a minute on that
Yes.
site, or a
Yes.
couple minutes?
Well, I am a writing coach. I take clients. I have stuff on that about writing and how I think of writing itself as a spiritual practice, and how I work with people. I have a whole bunch of people's endorsements that worked with me over the years and helped a lot of people write a lot of books.
Yeah. And again, they can get more information at iowawritingcoach.com, iowawritingcoach.com, and maryallenwriter.com. I just love talking with you. You're just
Me
you're
too.
a joy in our world. Really are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
See, I get starting to get emotional.
Me
Thank-
too. Maybe it'll be another time.
Yeah. Oh, if you're up for it, there'll be.
I'm all totally up for it. I would love to. It's so much fun to talk to you.
I and so wonderful to talk with you also, Mary Ellen. Oh, I'm going to be an emotional mess in a couple of minutes. Thank you so much. Just
You
love
too.
talking
Thank
with her,
you.
folks. Mary Ellen, again, Mary Ellen, writer. I'm so impacted by her work. So impacted.